In the winter of 2024, antique photograph appraiser David Harrison received an unusual call from the Berkshire County Historical Society in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. The society had recently acquired a collection of early 20th century photographs from the estate of a prominent local family, and one particular image had disturbed several staff members who had examined it. "We have a 1903 family portrait that's been causing quite a stir among our archivists," explained Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the Society's chief curator. "At first glance, it appears to be a typical formal family photograph from that era, but there's something about one of the children in the portrait that's deeply unsettling." Harrison, who had spent 25 years examining vintage photographs and solving authentication mysteries, was intrigued by the curator's description. Photographs that disturbed experienced archivists usually contained elements that violated normal expectations for family portraiture of the period. The Berkshire County Historical Society occupied a stately brick building on South Street, and Dr. Warren met Harrison in the Society's climate-controlled research facility, where the newly acquired collection was being processed. The room contained dozens of photographs, documents, and personal items that had belonged to the Blackwood family, one of Western Massachusetts's most prominent industrial families from the early 1900s. "This is the photograph that's been troubling our staff," Dr. Warren said, carefully placing an 8x10-inch portrait on the examination table. "It shows the Blackwood family of Lee, Massachusetts. The portrait was taken at a professional studio in Springfield in the autumn of 1903. The photograph depicted a well-dressed family of four posed in the formal style, typical of professional studio portraiture from 1903. At first examination, everything appeared completely normal. A prosperous family documenting their social status. Through expensive professional photography, Harrison examined the mounting and paper quality, confirming that the photograph was genuine and period-appropriate. The technical quality was excellent, indicating work by one of the region's premier photography studios. However, as Dr. Warren had indicated, there was indeed something deeply disturbing about one of the children that became apparent under closer scrutiny. The 1903 photograph showed the Blackwood family in their finest formal attire, positioned according to the established conventions of professional studio portraiture. The composition reflected both the photographer's technical skill and the family's obvious wealth, creating an image that conveyed respectability and social prominence. William Blackwood, a distinguished gentleman in his early 40s, stood behind, his seated wife wearing an expertly tailored dark suit with silk vest and gold watch chain. His posture conveyed the authority and confidence of a successful industrialist, and his expression reflected the serious demeanor considered appropriate for formal portraits of wealthy businessmen. Eleanor Blackwood sat gracefully in an ornate velvet chair, her elaborate dress featuring the intricate beadwork and lace details that indicated substantial financial resources. Her hair was arranged in the fashionable pompadour style of 1903, and she wore jewelry that suggested the family's considerable prosperity in Massachusetts' growing industrial economy. The couple's two children completed the family grouping. 12-year-old Charlotte stood beside her mother wearing a dress with sailor-style collar that was popular for girls from wealthy families, while 7-year-old Benjamin sat on a small cushioned stool near his father's feet, dressed in a formal suit with knee breeches and high stockings typical of boys' clothing from that era. The studio backdrop featured painted classical elements, marble columns, and garden scenery that created an atmosphere of refinement typical of Springfield's premier photography establishments. The photographer had arranged professional lighting to create even illumination across all four subjects, demonstrating the technical expertise expected from the region's most established portrait studios. Harrison examined each element of the photograph methodically, noting the period-appropriate clothing, jewelry, and studio props. Everything appeared authentic and consistent with 1903 American portrait photography. The family's positioning and expressions followed conventional patterns for formal family portraits of the era. However, when Harrison focused his professional magnifying equipment on 7-year-old Benjamin's face, he immediately understood why the Historical Society staff had been disturbed by the image. Harrison studied 7-year-old Benjamin Blackwood's face under high-powered magnification and felt a profound sense of unease. The child's eyes displayed characteristics that were deeply inappropriate for a boy of his age and completely inconsistent with normal childhood development patterns of 1903. Benjamin's eyes held an expression of cold, calculating intelligence, that belonged on an adult face, not that of a 7-year-old child. Rather than the innocence, curiosity, or even the formal seriousness expected in children's portraits from that era, his gaze conveyed an adult-like awareness of power dynamics and social manipulation. Most disturbing was the complete absence of any childlike qualities in Benjamin's expression. His eyes showed no trace of the natural spontaneity, emotional transparency, or innocent wonder that characterized children's faces in early 20th century photography. Instead, they reflected a sophisticated understanding of adult motivations and behaviors that suggested experiences far beyond his chronological age. Dr. Warren joined Harrison at the examination table, pointing out additional details that the Historical Society staff had noticed. "Look at the way he's positioned compared to his sister," she observed. "Charlotte shows typical childhood fidgeting and slight nervousness about holding still for the long exposure. But Benjamin appears completely comfortable and controlled, as if he's performed for cameras many times before." Harrison studied the contrast between the two children more carefully. Charlotte's face showed the natural expressiveness of a 12-year-old, slight nervous energy around her eyes, a somewhat forced smile, and the subtle signs of a child trying to meet adult expectations during a formal portrait session. Benjamin, however, displayed none of these normal childhood characteristics. His composure was unsettling in its completeness, suggesting either exceptional training in adult social behavior or exposure to experiences that had forced premature psychological maturation. Most troubling was the way Benjamin's eyes seemed to focus not on the camera, but slightly to one side, as if he was observing and evaluating someone else in the studio during the portrait session. This calculating gaze, combined with his unnaturally mature expression, created an impression that the 7-year-old was somehow in control of the situation, rather than simply participating in a family portrait. Harrison knew that understanding the context behind Benjamin Blackwood's disturbing expression would require extensive research into the family's history and circumstances in 1903. He began by examining the Historical Society's acquisition records to trace how the photograph collection had been obtained and what documentation existed about the Blackwood family. The collection had been donated to the Berkshire County Historical Society by Margaret Blackwood Stevens, the great-granddaughter of William and Eleanor Blackwood. According to her donation statement, the family photographs and documents had been stored in the attic of the family's estate in Lee, Massachusetts, for decades before she discovered them while settling her grandmother's affairs. Margaret's accompanying letter mentioned that her family had always been somewhat secretive about their early history in western Massachusetts, particularly regarding events from the 1900s. She noted that her grandmother had rarely spoken about her childhood and had seemed uncomfortable whenever old family photographs were displayed or discussed. Harrison contacted Margaret Blackwood Stevens to request additional information about the 1903 portrait and the circumstances surrounding it. During their phone conversation, Margaret revealed disturbing family stories that had been passed down through generations but never fully explained or understood. "My grandmother Charlotte, the girl in the photograph, used to say that something terrible happened to her brother Benjamin when they were children," Margaret explained. She would never give details, but she always insisted that Benjamin had been changed by some experience when he was very young. Margaret continued with more troubling family lore. Grandmother said that after 1903, adults in the family started treating Benjamin differently, almost like they were afraid of him. She claimed that he had somehow learned things that children shouldn't know, and that his behavior had become increasingly disturbing as he got older. These revelations suggested that the 1903 portrait had been taken during a significant period in the family's history, possibly documenting the aftermath of traumatic events that had profoundly affected young Benjamin. Harrison realized he needed to research local newspaper archives and official records from 1903 to understand what had happened to the Blackwood family during that crucial year. He also decided to investigate the broader context of the Blackwood family's business and social connections, hoping to identify circumstances that might have exposed a 7-year-old child to experiences that could have produced such an unnaturally mature and calculating expression. Harrison's research into the Blackwood family's business activities in 1903 revealed their involvement in Western Massachusetts' rapidly expanding textile industry, but also uncovered disturbing information about their labor practices and treatment of workers. Records at the Lee Historical Society showed that William Blackwood owned several textile mills that employed hundreds of workers, including many recent immigrants and their children. The Springfield Republican Archives from 1903 contained several articles about labor conditions in the region's textile mills, including reports about the use of child labor and unsafe working conditions that had resulted in injuries and deaths. While William Blackwood's mills were not specifically mentioned in these early reports, the articles described industry-wide practices that affected all major textile manufacturers. More significantly, Harrison discovered records from the Massachusetts Department of Factory Inspection that showed William Blackwood's mills had been subjects of investigation during 1903. State inspectors had been examining allegations that textile manufacturers were violating child labor laws and exposing young workers to dangerous machinery and toxic chemicals. The inspection records revealed that Blackwood's mills employed children as young as 8 years old in various capacities, including operating machinery that was considered dangerous even for adult workers. The state investigators had documented numerous safety violations and had found evidence that children were working longer hours than legally permitted. What made these discoveries particularly relevant to Benjamin's disturbing expression was the revelation that William Blackwood had sometimes brought his own children to observe operations at his textile mills. According to the inspection records, several witnesses had reported seeing the Blackwood children in the factories during working hours, supposedly to educate them about the family business. Harrison realized that 7-year-old Benjamin might have been regularly exposed to the exploitation and suffering of child workers who were barely older than himself. Witnessing the treatment of these vulnerable children could have provided him with premature knowledge about power, exploitation, and human suffering that would explain his unnaturally mature and calculating expression. The 1903 portrait might have been taken during a period when Benjamin was beginning to understand the source of his family's wealth and the human cost of their business success. Harrison's deeper research into the Massachusetts factory inspection records revealed that the investigation of William Blackwood's textile mills in 1903 had uncovered evidence of systematic child labor violations that were more severe than typical industry practices. The state inspectors had documented cases of children being forced to work in extremely dangerous conditions that had resulted in serious injuries and at least one death. The inspection files contained witness testimony from adult workers who described seeing children as young as 6 years old operating complex machinery without proper safety equipment or training. These child workers had been primarily the children of recent immigrants who were desperate for income and had little understanding of their legal rights or protections. Most disturbing were reports that William Blackwood had implemented a system of financial penalties and threats that prevented families from removing their children from factory work even when they became aware of the dangers. Workers who attempted to protect their children from hazardous assignments were threatened with job loss and eviction from company housing. The inspection records also revealed that Benjamin Blackwood had been present during several incidents where child workers had been injured by machinery. Witnesses reported that the 7-year-old had observed these accidents with unusual calm and had seemed more interested in his father's responses to the injuries than in the suffering of the wounded children. One particularly troubling witness account described Benjamin watching as a 9-year-old worker lost several fingers in a textile machine, and then observing his father calculate the financial cost of the injury rather than providing medical assistance to the child. The witness had noted that Benjamin had seemed to absorb his father's cold, business-focused response to human suffering. These experiences had apparently provided Benjamin with an education in the exercise of power over vulnerable people that was completely inappropriate for a child his age. He had learned to observe human suffering with the detached calculation of a business owner rather than the natural empathy expected from children. The factory inspection investigation had been quietly resolved through political influence and financial settlements that allowed William Blackwood to avoid criminal prosecution. However, the experience had apparently taught Benjamin valuable lessons about how wealth and social position could be used to avoid consequences for actions that harmed other people. Harrison discovered that the Massachusetts factory inspection Files contained detailed witness testimonies that provided disturbing insights into Benjamin Blackwood's behavior and psychological development during the 1903 investigation. Several adult workers had specifically mentioned the 7-year-old's presence during traumatic incidents at the textile mills. One textile worker, Maria Santos, had provided testimony describing Benjamin's reaction to a factory accident in which a 10-year-old girl had been severely burned by chemicals used in the dyeing process. According to Santos, Benjamin had watched the injured child suffering with what she described as the cold interest of someone studying an insect. Santos had also testified that Benjamin had asked his father detailed questions about why the injured children were not provided with medical care, and had seemed satisfied when William Blackwood explained that providing medical treatment would be too expensive and might encourage other workers to report injuries. Another witness, Thomas O'Brien, a machine operator, had described observing Benjamin during a meeting where William Blackwood had threatened to fire workers who complained about dangerous working conditions. O'Brien testified that the 7-year-old had watched his father's intimidation tactics with obvious fascination and had later been seen practicing similar threatening gestures and expressions. Most disturbing was testimony from Anna Kowalski, a supervisor who had worked closely with child laborers in Blackwood's mills. She had reported that Benjamin had begun visiting the factory regularly during the summer of 1903 and had developed what she described as an unhealthy interest in controlling the younger workers. Kowalski had testified that Benjamin had started giving orders to child workers who were older than himself, using threats and manipulation tactics that he had apparently learned by observing his father's management style. The workers had complied with Benjamin's demands because they feared that resistance might result in punishment from William Blackwood. These witness accounts revealed that Benjamin had not merely observed his father's exploitation of child workers, but had actively participated in exercising power over vulnerable children. This hands-on experience in manipulation and control had provided him with psychological tools and perspectives that were completely inappropriate for his age. The 1903 portrait had been taken shortly after these traumatic experiences, capturing Benjamin at a time when he had already learned to use intimidation and calculation as primary methods of interacting with other people. Harrison's research revealed that the Blackwood family's response to the factory inspection investigation had involved efforts to conceal Benjamin's exposure to the traumatic events at the textile mills. But these efforts had apparently come too late to prevent the psychological damage that was already evident in his behavior and expression. Private correspondence found in the family papers showed that Eleanor Blackwood had become increasingly concerned about her son's behavior during the summer of 1903. In letters to her sister, she had described Benjamin as having become unnaturally cold and calculating, and had expressed worry that his exposure to the family business had been inappropriate for a child of his tender years. Eleanor's letters revealed that she had attempted to persuade her husband to limit Benjamin's visits to the textile mills, but William Blackwood had insisted that early exposure to business operations was essential for preparing their son to eventually inherit and manage the family enterprises. The correspondence also showed that Eleanor had consulted with a Boston physician about Benjamin's behavior, describing symptoms that included an unusual lack of empathy for other children, an obsession with controlling and manipulating playmates, and what she described as an adult-like interest in causing distress to others. The physician's response, preserved in the family papers, had recommended that Benjamin be removed from all contact with the textile mills, and that the family should consider sending him to a boarding school where he could receive proper moral education and learn to interact appropriately with children his own age. However, William Blackwood had rejected these recommendations, apparently believing that Benjamin's developing business instincts were valuable assets that should be encouraged, rather than suppressed. He had viewed his son's calculating nature as evidence of natural leadership abilities that would serve the family well in future business endeavors. The 1903 portrait had been commissioned shortly after these family discussions, apparently as a way of documenting the family's unity and respectability during a period when their business practices were under government investigation. The portrait was intended to present the Blackwoods as a normal, prosperous family, despite the disturbing developments in Benjamin's psychological development. The family had hoped that Benjamin's unsettling expression would not be noticeable. To viewers who were unfamiliar with his actual behavior and personality, Harrison's investigation into Benjamin Blackwood's adult life revealed the long-term consequences of his childhood exposure to industrial exploitation and his early training in manipulating vulnerable people. Records from local newspapers and business archives showed that Benjamin had grown into exactly the kind of ruthless businessman that his childhood experiences had prepared him to become. Benjamin had taken control of the family textile mills in the 1920s and had expanded operations throughout western Massachusetts and Connecticut. Newspaper reports from that period described his business practices as particularly harsh, even by the standards of an industry known for poor treatment of workers. Labor union records from the 1920s and 1930s showed that Benjamin's mills had been frequent targets of strikes and protests due to unsafe working conditions, below subsistence wages, and the continued use of child labor despite strengthened legal protections. Union organizers had specifically mentioned Benjamin's personal involvement in intimidating workers and their families. Most disturbing were court records from several lawsuits filed against Benjamin's companies by families of workers who had been killed or permanently disabled in industrial accidents. The legal documents revealed a pattern of negligence and callous disregard for worker safety that exceeded even the typically poor standards of early 20th century manufacturing. The court records also showed that Benjamin had used the same intimidation tactics he had learned as a child, threatening workers and their families with job loss, eviction, and blacklisting if they attempted to seek compensation for injuries or deaths. His ability to manipulate legal and political systems had allowed him to avoid meaningful consequences for business practices that caused tremendous human suffering. Personal accounts from workers and community members described Benjamin as a man who seemed to derive satisfaction from exercising power over vulnerable people. Several testimonies mentioned his habit of personally observing dangerous work operations, apparently enjoying the fear and desperation of workers who knew they were risking their lives for minimal compensation. Benjamin had never married or had children, apparently lacking the capacity for normal emotional relationships that his childhood experiences had destroyed. He had remained focused entirely on accumulating wealth and power through the exploitation of others, fulfilling the psychological trajectory that had been established during his traumatic exposure to industrial violence as a 7-year-old child. Harrison's investigation concluded with the recognition that the 1903 family portrait had captured a 7-year-old child who had already been psychologically damaged by premature exposure to industrial exploitation and violence. Benjamin Blackwood's disturbing expression reflected not just unusual maturity, but the beginning of a lifetime pattern of using power to harm vulnerable people. The portrait served as evidence of how childhood trauma and inappropriate adult influences could fundamentally alter a child's psychological development, creating an individual who lacked normal human empathy and moral constraints. Benjamin's calculating gaze had been the result of learning to view other people as objects to be manipulated, rather than human beings deserving of compassion and respect. Harrison's research had also revealed the broader social context that had enabled Benjamin's psychological development. The early 20th century's inadequate child labor protections and weak enforcement of industrial safety regulations had created an environment where children could be exposed to traumatic experiences that would have lasting consequences for their emotional and moral development. The Blackwood family's wealth and social position had protected them from meaningful scrutiny of their role in damaging their own child's psychological development. Their ability to suppress investigation of their business practices had also prevented intervention that might have protected Benjamin from further exposure to industrial violence and exploitation. Most significantly, Harrison realized that Benjamin's adult career as a ruthless industrialist had been the direct result of his childhood experiences in his father's textile mills. The 7-year-old who had learned to observe human suffering with cold calculation had grown into an adult who actively created suffering for financial gain. The 1903 portrait was valuable not just as a historical artifact, but as documentation of how social and economic systems that exploit vulnerable people can also damage the children of the exploiters themselves. Benjamin's disturbing expression captured the moment when childhood innocence had been replaced by premature knowledge of how power could be used to cause harm. As Harrison prepared his final report for the Berkshire County Historical Society, He reflected on how a single unsettling detail in an old photograph had revealed a story of childhood trauma, moral corruption, and the long-term consequences of exposing children to adult violence and exploitation. The portrait served as a warning about the psychological damage that could result when children were treated as participants in, rather than protected from the worst aspects of adult society.